The world's first set of surviving septuplets are turning 28 years old today.
These are babies, and how can you decide that you're going to have this one and you're not going to have that one? How do you choose which one?
In the fall of 1997, in a small town in the American Midwest, a young couple sat in front of a group of doctors and heard something that had almost never been said to any patient in the history of modern medicine. Not twins. Not triplets. 7 separate heartbeats, 7 separate lives, all growing inside one woman's body at the same time. What happened next would turn a quiet Iowa family into one of the most talked about stories on the planet, and nearly 30 years later, the 7 people at the center of it are living lives nobody in that hospital room could have imagined. This is the story of the McCoy septuplets, and where they are today. Carlisle, Iowa is the kind of place most people drive through without noticing. A few thousand residents, a main street, a handful of churches, and the kind of community where neighbors actually know each other's names. It was here that Kenny and Bobby McCoy were raising their young daughter, Michaela, and hoping to give her a brother or sister. But getting pregnant a second time wasn't happening the way it had the first time, and eventually a doctor gave them a diagnosis. Bobby's body wasn't producing the hormones needed to trigger ovulation on its own. The recommended treatment was a fertility drug called Metrodin, an injectable hormone medication designed to help stimulate egg production. It was not an exotic or experimental treatment. It had already helped thousands of couples conceive, usually resulting in a single pregnancy, and occasionally in twins. The couple went in expecting, at most, the possibility of a multiple birth on a small scale. Nobody sat them down beforehand and mentioned the number 7, because at that point in medical history, a surviving set of 7 had never happened. It wasn't considered a realistic outcome to plan for. Then came the ultrasound. What the technician saw on the screen that day didn't match anything in the standard playbook. Instead of 1 shadow or 2, there were 7 distinct shapes, 7 separate rhythms pulsing on the monitor. The scan had to be repeated and double-checked because the number seemed almost impossible to believe. But the count held. Bobby McCoy, at just 6 weeks along, was carrying 7 babies at once. What followed was not a single dramatic meeting but a series of increasingly serious conversations between the McCoys and their medical team over the following weeks. The math of carrying 7 fetuses to any reasonable stage of development was brutal. A human uterus is built to comfortably carry 1 baby, sometimes 2. 7 is a different category of medical challenge entirely, with steeply rising risks of miscarriage, stillbirth, and dangerous complications for the mother, including high blood pressure, extreme physical strain on the heart and lungs, and the possibility of losing some or all of the pregnancy. Doctors at the time were candid about those risks, and multifetal pregnancies of this scale were, and still are, one of the situations where physicians will often raise the option of selective reduction, a procedure in which the number of fetuses is reduced early in pregnancy in order to improve the survival odds and health outcomes for the babies who remain. It's a conversation that happens in maternal-fetal medicine offices around the world, and it is rarely an easy one for any family to sit through. For Kenny and Bobby, it wasn't a decision they were willing to make. Their Christian faith played a central role in how they approached the pregnancy, and they chose to continue carrying all 7 babies rather than reduce the number, trusting that the outcome, whatever it turned out to be, was not theirs to engineer. It was a decision that, once it became public, divided opinion across the country. Some admired the couple's conviction. Others, including some medical professionals, worried publicly that the choice put both Bobby's life and the baby's lives at greater risk than necessary. The McCoys stayed largely quiet about the criticism and focused instead on getting through each week of the pregnancy. As the pregnancy progressed, Bobby's body was put through an extraordinary physical test. She was placed on strict bed rest for months, unable to safely move around or stand for extended periods as her abdomen grew to accommodate 7 growing babies. By the final weeks, her midsection had expanded to a size rarely seen in pregnancy, and doctors monitored her constantly for warning signs of the complications they had feared from the beginning. Carrying that much weight and that much physical strain for months at a time is not something any one person can manage alone, and the McCoys didn't have to. Their church community and neighbors in Carlisle organized volunteers to help around the house, prepare meals, and simply keep Bobby company during the long stretches when she couldn't do much more than lie still and wait. It was small-town support on a scale that would end up mattering just as much in the years that followed as it did during the pregnancy itself. Against the odds that had been laid out in that first serious conversation with doctors, all 7 babies kept growing. Week after week, the ultrasounds kept coming back with 7 steady heartbeats. Nobody could promise how it would end, but the pregnancy that doctors had once described as one of the riskiest they'd ever seen was, against expectation, still holding together. The delivery took place at Iowa Methodist Medical Center in Des Moines, roughly 9 weeks premature, and it was handled with the kind of coordination usually reserved for a small-scale medical operation. A team of around 40 specialists, obstetricians, neonatologists, anesthesiologists, and nurses, were assembled for a scheduled cesarean section. 7 incubators were prepared and waiting in a nearby unit. In the span of about 6 minutes, all 7 babies were delivered, one after another. Kenneth Robert, born first and weighing just over 3 pounds. Alexis May, weighing 2 pounds 11 ounces. Natalie Sue, at 2 pounds 10 ounces. Kelsey and, the smallest at 2 pounds 5 ounces. Nathan Roy, at 3 pounds 3 ounces. Brandon James, at 2 pounds 14 ounces. And Joel Stephen, the last born, at 2 pounds 15 ounces. Every single one of them was alive. It was, and remains, the first known case of a full set of septuplets all surviving birth. The story exploded almost instantly. News crews descended on Des Moines from around the world. It wasn't just a local human interest story, it was treated as a genuine medical landmark, discussed on network news and in medical journals alike. Then President Bill Clinton personally called the family to offer his congratulations, a detail that captures just how far the story had traveled beyond Iowa. Donations, gifts, and offers of help poured in from strangers across the country. A local company built the family a larger home to accommodate their newly enormous household. The McCoys accepted the help they genuinely needed for their children's care, while trying, as much as they could, to keep the rest of their life low-key and normal. Surviving delivery was only the beginning. All 7 babies were extremely premature, and each of them needed intensive care to make it through their first weeks and months. Being born at roughly 2 to 3 pounds means underdeveloped lungs, immature organ systems, and a long road of monitoring, feeding support, and, for some, ongoing medical intervention just to reach the basic milestones that most infants hit without any difficulty. 2 of the 7, Alexis and Nathan, were later diagnosed with cerebral palsy, a condition connected to the extreme prematurity of their birth that affects muscle control and movement. Over the following years, both of them went through numerous surgeries and worked with physical therapists, moving in stages from crawling, to using crutches, to walkers and leg braces, gradually building the strength and coordination that came far more easily to their siblings. Once the babies were healthy enough to leave the hospital, the McCoy household became something closer to a small operation than a typical family home. At the peak of infancy, the family was going through dozens of bottles and dozens of diapers every single day, on a schedule that left almost no room for anything resembling a full night's sleep. Once again, the community of Carlisle stepped in. Volunteers rotated through the house in shifts, helping with feeding, laundry, and the basic logistics of keeping 7 infants alive and cared for around the clock, giving Bobby and Kenny the support they needed to function as parents rather than simply survive the exhaustion. From the moment they were born, the McCoy septuplets were public figures whether they had any say in it or not. Magazines ran cover stories and yearly updates. Television specials checked in on the family at major milestones. As the children got older, that attention didn't fade the way most news stories eventually do. It followed them through childhood, adolescence, and well into their teenage years, with national outlets returning again and again to mark birthdays and answer the recurring question of how the septuplets were doing. Inside the house, though, Kenny and Bobby worked hard to keep things ordinary. The 7 kids went to public school in Carlisle alongside their peers, did chores, had rules, and were expected to behave like any other kids in town, not like celebrities. They shared a home, shared responsibilities, and grew up constantly surrounded by 6 siblings who understood exactly what they were going through, because they were going through the same thing. That shared experience created a bond between the 7 of them that's hard to fully explain to anyone who didn't grow up as part of a multiple birth on that scale. They moved through the same schools, sat in the same classrooms at different points, and were introduced to strangers, for most of their childhood, not by their individual names first but as one of the septuplets. Even so, by most accounts from the family over the years, they held on to their individual personalities and interests, and stayed remarkably close to one another heading into adulthood. In May of 2016, all 7 siblings graduated together from Carlisle High School. It was a moment the town had been waiting nearly 2 decades to see, and it drew a level of attention rarely seen at a small-town high school ceremony. National news crews, out-of-town visitors, and a packed auditorium full of people who had followed this family's story since before any of the graduates could form a memory of their own. By that point, Alexis and Nathan, who had spent years working through physical therapy for cerebral palsy, had made enough progress that they were able to take part in the ceremony alongside their siblings, a moment that carried extra weight given how uncertain their mobility outlook had once seemed. Around this same time, the family began talking publicly about what came next for each of the seven, and for the first time since November of 1997, their individual paths were about to genuinely diverge. Kenny Jr. talked about heading into the construction trade. Kelsey, who had been part of the school's all-state choir program, talked about pursuing music. Brandon had already made the boldest decision of the group. He had enlisted in the United States Army and was preparing to leave for basic training that summer, becoming the first of the seven to move away from Iowa on his own. Several of the siblings, Kelsey, Nathan, Natalie, and Joel, planned to attend Hannibal LaGrange University in Missouri, a small Christian college that had offered full scholarships to all 7 McCoy children back when they were born, an offer the school had kept on the table for 18 years. Kenny and Alexis chose to stay closer to home and continue their education around the Des Moines area. Nearly 3 decades after that first ultrasound in Iowa, the McCoy septuplets are no longer children being written about. They're adults quietly building careers, marriages, and families of their own, largely out of the public eye they grew up in. Kenny Jr. followed through on his plan to work with his hands. He trained in cabinetry and carpentry and has built a career doing custom cabinet work in central Iowa. He got married, and by most accounts from the family in recent years, he and his wife have started a family of their own. He's spoken about how strange the quiet can feel after growing up surrounded by 6 siblings at all times. A full house was simply what normal looked like for the first 18 years of his life, and an empty kitchen table can still catch him off guard. Brandon followed through on his plan to join the Army, shipping out for basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, shortly after graduation and going on to build a career in the military. Of all 7 siblings, his life has understandably stayed the most private, given the nature of military service, and the family has generally kept details about his exact postings and deployments out of public reporting. He has, by various accounts, married and started a family, making him one of several of the septuplets to become a parent. Natalie has built a career connected to sports and athletics, working in athletic training in the years after college, and has since married and had a child of her own. Kelsey moved into a career in a medical office setting after her years at Hannibal LaGrange, and has also gotten married and grown her own family. Alexis, who spent years in physical therapy working through the effects of cerebral palsy, has continued to defy the early expectations doctors had for her mobility, going on to work in a field connected to caring for children, something she reportedly wanted for herself for a long time. Nathan, who also lives with cerebral palsy, moved into a career connected to information technology and has continued to build an independent adult life for himself in the Des Moines area. Joel has largely stayed out of the spotlight compared to some of his siblings, continuing on the path that began with his time at Hannibal LaGrange. Their older sister, Michaela, the daughter Bobby and Kenny already had before the septuplets came along, has also grown up, gotten married, and started a family of her own, meaning that Bobby and Kenny now find themselves with grandchildren from multiple sides of a family that was once defined entirely by 7 babies born in a single afternoon. It's worth stepping back and considering how unlikely this entire outcome was. When Bobby McCoy and her doctors first had that difficult conversation about the risks of carrying 7 babies to term, there was no real precedent to point to. No family had ever gone through this and had every child survive. The medical concerns raised at the time weren't exaggerated for effect. Multifetal pregnancies on that scale carry genuinely serious risks, and the reduction option doctors discussed with the family is a standard, medically recognized part of managing those risks in cases like this one. What makes the McCoy story unusual isn't that the family faced a difficult decision. Plenty of families in similar situations have faced the same one, and have made different choices for reasons that are entirely their own. What makes it unusual is the outcome. All 7 children not only survived birth, but grew into adulthood, walked across a graduation stage together, and are now, in their late 20s, living full and mostly ordinary lives as electricians, soldiers, caregivers, and parents in their own right. Bobby McCoy has spoken over the years about how the family tried to shield the children from the intensity of the public attention they never asked for, while still being grateful for the support that got them through those first exhausting years. The community of Carlisle, Iowa, played as big a role in this story as any hospital did. The volunteers who showed up during the pregnancy, the church members who rotated through the house during infancy, and the small college that quietly kept a scholarship offer open for 18 years, all shaped how this family was able to get from that beige hospital conference room to 7 separate adult lives, each one distinct, and yet still connected by a bond very few people on Earth will ever understand. Nearly 30 years on, the 7 McCoy siblings aren't headline news anymore, and by most accounts, that's exactly how they'd prefer it. They check in with each other constantly, gather when they can, and carry inside jokes and shared history that started before any of them could talk. What began as one of the most medically improbable pregnancies ever recorded has become something much quieter and, in its own way, much more remarkable. 7 ordinary lives, built out of an extraordinary beginning.